What is the worst English skill that your students have? Is it speaking? I think it probably is. It's one of the most important things that we need to teach in an IELTS class, but it can be one of the most difficult for the students to master. So today we're going to be talking all about this, so let's get into it. Hi guys, my name is Phil, welcome to this channel. Today we're going to be talking about IELTS speaking, and I just want to give you a bit of a breakdown as to how I would approach speaking and how to teach it in a class. Now I will be going into a lot more detail in the future with different videos, but today I kind of want to give you a bit of an overview and give you some tips what you can use immediately in your classrooms. So the first thing to know is that actually there are 4 parts to the speaking test. There's actually something we call part 0, which is all to do with the kind of introduction to the examiner, the administration. Then there's part 1, part 2 and part 3. So we're going to talk about each of these parts individually. Now the one thing I would say is that if I was going to teach this all at once, I may not teach every single part in the same class. I may split it across a couple of classes. And also today I'm really going to be talking about teaching it as in the first time ever that the student's seen it. But you can of course use these ideas in future lessons just to keep recycling it and to repeat it. So first of all, part 0, what happens exactly? Well, the student's going to walk into the examination room and meet the examiner. They're going to be given certain instructions, things like, would you please sit down? Then they're going to be asked for their ID to prove who they are. And there's just a few little questions like this, what's your name on your passport and which name would you like to be called? So you've got to practice this a little bit so that the student knows it's going to happen, it's just a formality, and they shouldn't spend too much time trying to talk to the examiner at this point. They really want to get into part 1 and not to waste too much time on just talking about what their name is. The other thing is, I know that a lot of examiners get annoyed where the student doesn't follow the instructions. So tell them to do exactly what they're going to be told. So if you just practice this, role play it a few times, then they know what to expect. Do it again just before they're likely to take the test and it will be firmly in their mind. Okay, let's move on and talk about the next part. So for part 1, if I was teaching a group for the first time, this is probably what I would do. I would firstly prepare some questions and have at least 3 different sets of questions, because that's exactly what they're going to have in the real exam. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the format of the speaking test, why not check out this video, it's up here, and I've gone over and just broken down how the speaking test is formatted and exactly what to expect, so you can check it out in that video. So in part 1, they're giving 3 different sets of questions, and the first set of questions is always going to be the same. It's always going to be one of 2 topics, either work and study or home life. So make sure that you have one of those options in your materials, just so they know exactly what to expect, and it's going to be a real life situation. So got 3 sets of questions which you have prepared for your students. What I would then do is to write an example question on the board and just elicit an answer from the class, maybe a few answers. At this point, you're just kind of seeing how they would naturally answer the question. You haven't taught them anything at the moment. So we put that on the board, and then what I would do is teach them a sort of a formula to answer the questions. So in part 1, we don't really want to have extremely long answers. What we want is kind of a main point which is backed up with a couple of supporting sentences. So if it's asking you about an opinion about something, you would give your opinion and then explain reasons why, or maybe add some details or give an example. And generally somewhere between 2 to 3 sentences is about a good length for it. If you want to hear an example of how to extend a part 1 answer well, you can actually check out a video that I have on my other YouTube channel called the IELTS Grind, which I do with my colleague Michael. It's where we actually teach students how to take the exam. And there's a video there which I will link to in the description of me answering some questions about work or study. And you can kind of see how I did it there. So once you've taught them the formula on the board, Now I would go and get the class to try and improve the example answers that we have there. How could we extend them? How could we make them sound a little bit better and a little bit more information? In addition to this, I would also prepare some lists of phrases for things like explaining, justifying, giving examples, adding information. So phrases and cohesive devices that you can put in front of the students and they can actually refer to as they're trying to either correct the sentences on the board or for later on when they're trying to come up with their own answers. Now, I don't know about you, but when I have a class of more than sort of 2 or 3 people, it's kind of hard to give enough attention to everyone. So the only way that I really found of listening to everyone at least once in the class is to get them to do a group question activity. So what I normally do is I get one student to ask a question to another student, and then that student asks a question to the other one. I have a lot of fun with it. I normally say, okay, Cindy, for example, choose the most difficult question on the list and ask the person that you hate the most. It gets a lot of a laugh and it kind of relaxes everyone a little bit. So here we're going to be listening to everyone in the class answer at least one question. Now, what I normally do is keep a sort of note of general errors that apply to everyone and then specific errors for that speaker. So once the student makes a particular error just that they normally make, I will correct them on the spot. But I will keep all the general errors for later on. So after we've all asked one question or a couple of questions, depending on the size of your class and how much time you have, I then go and put all the common errors that could help everybody onto the board, and I normally put the mistake up and ask them how can we improve it. That way they're always kind of being made aware of the mistakes, and I think it kind of makes them identify it and correct it themselves. If I just put the correct form, it doesn't seem to have as good an effect as them correcting themselves. Now at this stage, everyone's nice and warmed up. We've had a few good examples. They've got the phrases in front of them. They've probably seen most of the questions already in the group asking phase. And now what I do is pair them up or into small groups and get them to ask each other questions. And I give them, for example, if it's a pair, I'd like to give them about 10 minutes so they can each have a 5-minute part 1 speaking test. And generally I find it's best to get them to ask a question back and forth rather than all the questions at once. And at this stage, what I'm doing is I'm walking around the class and I'm just listening in and again, taking notes for any errors that I hear, both personal errors for the students and general errors that affect everyone. And I'm going to do the same thing. At the end of this activity, I'm going to put those errors on the board and get them to correct them again. Now, if you've got time in your class, you may want to do this a couple times, changing partners. The more they do it and the more corrections you can give, the more feedback you give them, the better they will get. And the more often you do this, they're going to get even better. So in part 2, unlike in part 1, they're not going to be interviewed. It's actually in part 2, they're going to be talking about a prompt for up to 2 minutes. Now, I always think this is the most difficult part of the IELTS speaking test, even for natives. But one thing that's really going to help them out is good preparation. So they are given 1 minute by the examiner to come up with ideas. Now, the thing is, these prompts, these topics are they're repeated quite a lot. They're normally something like describe a person or describe a memory, a situation, and they're generally topics that they should be familiar with. So you can prepare them by doing lots and lots of examples and kind of pointing out the similarities between the topics. But another thing that they really need to learn is how to come up with ideas quickly. So brainstorming ideas. And there are kind of different methods to do this, but I'm going to talk about 2 methods that you can try. One of them is called the story method and one of them is called the question method. So the story method is basically they prepare themselves a story. So if the prompt was describe a happy memory you had from your childhood, they're literally going to tell the examiner a story about that. So they come up with key words that kind of help them navigate a story. The other option is with question methods. So if you look at a prompt for part 2, they're always given the topic and then they're given some ideas. Now, you should say, and they're normally given 4 points. An interesting thing here is those 4 points, if they don't talk about them, that's absolutely fine. They're not penalised in any way. But with the question method, those points are already kind of questions. And what the student does is come up with just more questions, and they're literally just answering the questions as they go through the 2 minutes. So you should definitely teach the students both methods, and there are also other ways to approach this. But teach them both methods in different classes, because some students will find the story method easier and some will find the question method easier. And also for certain prompts, one might be easier than the other. So at this stage, what I'm going to do is take a prompt and put it on the board, and then with the students, we're going to take one or other of the methods, possibly doing both at the same time, and develop the answer, develop some ideas and sort of brainstorm it. At the same time, what I'm going to try and teach them is how to make notes. So they shouldn't be writing full sentences. It should be single words or short phrases. So as I go through it, I'm going to come up with vocabulary, put that on the board, just so I can remember when I'm doing my speech. And also I'm going to put up some grammar. So what I mean by that is you should help them identify good places where they can use particular grammar. So for example, I always say that when you have your introduction to your part 2, that's a good place to use the second conditional. For example, well, you know, if I had to talk about a memory I had from my childhood which was happy, I would have to say it was when I blah, blah, blah. So I'm just fitting in some complex grammar there, okay? As naturally as I can, because you don't want to teach them to rehearse things. It has to sound natural in order to count for the grading. So once I've gone through this on the board and we've done it as a class, I will ask the students to do exactly the same prompt for themselves. Now, normally, if it's the first time they've done it, I will give them a good 5 minutes to practice. But as we get closer to the exam, or as their level improves, I'll give them less and less time until we hit about 1 minute. So they develop their ideas for the prompt, then I'm going to put them in pairs. And another thing I'm going to do for the prompt is to give them a list of grammatical structures they should try and use. Things like relative clauses. Can you try and use a conditional? Can you try and use contrasting structures? And as they're working in pairs, one of them will be speaking, and I will ask the other one to listen and see how many of those things did they talk about. So you can do this in many different ways. It can be grammar, it can be vocabulary, whatever you want. And one of them's listening out to see if they used it. And then at the end of the 2 minutes, then you can go through and ask, you know, who managed to do everything, who didn't, and they can put their hands up and things like this. So that's the first time. Then I would get them to work either on the same prompt or on a second one and put them into different pairs. This time I'm going to ask the student that's listening to summarize what the person said. So they will listen for 2 minutes, and then that person has 30 seconds to give a summary of what the person said. This is really helpful because it's going to help them practice paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is a very important skill in the IELTS. What I might do now is to take another prompt and get them to develop their answers again. And this time when I pair them up, the person who's listening is going to ask them a question based on what they said, because this is what the examiner will do. So the examiner will ask them a question after 2 minutes to interrupt them, to just move them on to the next part. So here I'm going to make it very clear that this is the only question in the IELTS that the student can give a very short answer to. So this is something that you need to teach them, because I think it annoys examiners when they waffle on for this question, because they're literally just trying to say, okay, time to shut up, let's go over to part 3. So if I was teaching part 3 for the first time to a new class, what I would do is explain to them that this part is where we're going to be looking at some abstract questions. So these questions are always on the same topic, near enough to part 2, the same theme, but they go into a little bit more detail, so they need an answer that goes into a little bit more detail too. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can approach these questions, but generally what we're trying to do is develop the answer. So there are different methods. One method you could teach them is the list method, and another one which is kind of going from general to specific. So if the student gets a question where they kind of have a few ideas that they could talk about, this is ideal to use the list method. So here the student starts off with a topic sentence where they tell the examiner that they're going to talk about more than one thing. What I mean by that is if the question is how can the government help improve public transport, their topic sentence might be there are several ways in which the government can help improve public transport. And then the examiner knows, right, we're going to listen to more than one point here. Then after that, they're going to list it out. So the main way is X, Y, and Z. Another way is X, Y, and Z, and so on. And for each point, they're going to make their main point, their main idea, and then support it with supporting sentences and develop it. Hopefully, they're going to add detail or explain why their point is connected to the topic, or give an example. So this is one method. Another method is going from general to specific. And this is really good for students when they have no idea what to say. So generally what they're going to do is to paraphrase the question to give them time to think and then concentrate on a main idea. So if the same question, how can the government help improve public transport? They might say, well, I imagine there are various ways that the government can do this, and some of them could be more effective than others. Okay, I'm thinking. And then, they come up with an idea. But the main way is X, Y, and Z. So this is really useful for the questions where you don't really know what to say straight away. So very much like part one, what I would do is put an example question on the board and then elicit a response. And then once we've got that up, I would teach them the format, and together as a class, we would try and fix the answer or improve it. And we do this a couple of times. So after coming up with these examples on the board, what I would do is again do a class activity. This is really so I can listen to each individual and give some feedback to them. Again, after that, I would pair them up and give them about 5 minutes per student to go through this. So in a pair, about 10 minutes. If you had to do a group of 3 for any reason, you give them about 15 minutes and get them to go through the questions and try to answer in the same way. At which point I'm going round listening to give them more feedback and put that on the board so they can correct it as a class, and just kind of giving feedback in that way. Guys, these were just some tips. This is how I would approach the very first time teaching the IELTS speaking test. As I said, you might want to split this up into different classes, because if you bombarded the students with all this information at once, it may not be that effective. So I will be going into more detail on each part of the speaking test and giving you some real examples, some real lesson plans that you can copy and use in your own classes. So the best way to avoid missing that is to actually subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, so when those videos come out, you can watch them straight away and just steal all that information for your own classes. Okay guys, I'm Phil and you've been watching the English Grind, and I will see you in a future video. Bye bye.